pass the question over to Håkan, who gave very interesting input yesterday on urban pedagogy in the Weimar Republic in Germany. And my question would be, like, what could we learn from this in connection to what we heard from Kathy and Luis?
So I have to start?
Please.
I thought I would be the last one. Concerning the question about the reform movement, which I talked a little bit about yesterday, and we had a workshop also connecting to that way of thinking, dealt with a group of educational reformers in German-speaking towns in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and they all tried to integrate the urban environment and urban landscape. I'm just telling you this because I think that there perhaps are people here who did not participate in the workshop. They tried to integrate the urban landscape into the curriculum and making pupils, especially pupils attending schools, as I showed you now in this presentation, primary schools, working class kids, to, out of knowledge about their immediate environment, reach certain social skills. And these reformers, I would not say that they were technically revolutionary, but they tried to make the best out of the utilities that they had at hand, which was a rather strict curriculum before the Weimar Republic, very top-down, and it was a curriculum that also focused very much on literacy, but on a kind of a literacy that was not meant to enhance individuality, but rather like a copy and paste literacy with very hierarchical structures of what you're supposed to read and how you're supposed to write. And for these reformers, it was crucial that the pupils got the ability to self-express themselves and use the reading and writing abilities from school to be able to direct and find orientation in a new society. And what is to be learned from them, I think is something that also could connect to what Catherine said about the borderline, or about the borderlands, because what they actually did, and where they were very successful, and then also a great source of inspiration for many reformers later in the 20th century, was that they worked exactly on the fringes between society and school. They sort of picked up the changes in society and tried to implement them in the school. But also without like throwing out the child with the bathwater, what you say, that they still believed that the deep roots of school education had values that you should nourish. You just use them in another way, more adapted for modern society.
What I would say to that is, I've been thinking, I found this morning really interesting, thinking about the connections between the three of us, and I'm still thinking about what I think, you know what I mean? And things keep occurring to me, and I think language is really important, and if, you know, inventing new ideas is important, like borderlands, maybe it came to me, is quite important. I think language is dangerous sometimes as well. So when we talk about the ideal school, to be very careful, because ideal means there's something there to be arrived at, and it connects with what we've been saying about utopia. And what I tried to suggest through Colin Ward's idea of the exploding school, and children's idea of school being dynamic, full of life and energy, full of life needing to be cared for. So I think we need to think about language and those borderlands. And it occurred to me just now, thinking about Paulo Freire, that I started my career as an adult education worker, and we worked with Freirean principles. So we worked with groups of workers who worked for the local state, who had been rejected by the schooling system, had failed at school. And we worked with, dustbin collectors, school cleaners, dinner ladies, gardeners, who had been rejected by education and who rejected education. And we worked with them to develop a curriculum as they came for 1 day a week away from work. And the curriculum was around what they wanted to know. And the resources were the city, the local city, or the other cities where we took them to find the answers, find experts to tell us. So we worked in a very similar way to how Colin Ward envisaged working. And I think it was a cultural thing at the time. We were hopeful, we were interested in new kinds of pedagogies, new kinds of empowerment. And Colin Ward's work is situated in the 1970s and 80s, in that time. And at that time, because of the post-war consensus, there was a public sector. There were public facilities. Now we have libraries being closed down. We have everything becoming privatized, which makes the kind of pedagogy we've been talking about more difficult to achieve. And it's that border between the school and the community and what we might call our collective public investment in society that really matters. All those borders really matter. So that's what's in my mind at the moment.
Yeah, yesterday I talked a little bit about the idea of the knowledge, right? And I think I talked about today, and I was thinking of the connections of with knowledge, power, and space. I was thinking a lot about your examples. For example, of the schools for the working class being the architects being considered of the beauty that had to be there. It struck to me because I think that connects very well with the case of Porto Alegre. It's not that they thought of beauty, but they thought of buildings that are not makeshift, or buildings that are not going to fall apart in 2 months or something like that, which is the case of many schools in Brazil. So just the idea of building a building that is solid, that is the best building in the neighborhood, which can provide spaces, like you were saying, spaces for these communities. Remember, you have to imagine it's communities have no presence of the state there. So it's like this no man's land, and all of a sudden there's this building where the community can use, where they can use it at night for their meetings, or where there's a library, where all of a sudden there's this new space that is present and that is respected. And I think that connects with knowledge as well, because the message that we send to poor families, usually by having horrible schools for them, is that we don't care about you, really. This is the kind of buildings that you get. You're not going to get anything better than this. And by being conscious of the need to, there's a very important sort of image going on, a pedagogical image going on, by building schools that are solid in those particular communities, because that symbolizes the compromise, the statement that the state is there, and this is a place of the community. I think this is really important, and it connects also to your talk as well. So I think those are crucial ideas.
Thank you. I have a question to Kathy. You said that the whole curriculum could be taught through the arts. How could that look like?
Okay, the whole curriculum was taught through the arts at a school called Stewart Street School in Birmingham in the 1940s, during the war years, and I've written about this with Ian Grosvenor. So if you go to my webpage, if you're interested, we've written a couple of articles about that school. It's a really interesting example. An elementary school, a really gruesome-looking building, very high, dark, designed for didactic education. But the war had some positive effects in education in that it allowed teachers to experiment. And already the ideas of education through art had strongly been there from the 1930s, actually, before Herbert Reed wrote his book. Arthur Stone was the headmaster of this particular school, and he took it upon himself to experiment, and he created a curriculum that was taught entirely through the arts, through the dramatic and performing and visual arts. And this was an extraordinary school that attracted a lot of attention, no least from the Ministry of Education. In 1949, the minister, the senior inspector of schools, Christian Schiller, asked Arthur Stone, the head teacher, to write about what he was doing in this school. And he wrote a pamphlet called Story of a School, which was also illustrated with beautiful images of children working in the school. And this was a school in the poorest part of Birmingham. It was it was definitely a public school. And this pamphlet was sent out free to all new primary schools. I say new because 1944, the legislation created primary education in England and Wales. So every school in the country was sent this pamphlet, Story of a School, which just set out how the curriculum, the primary curriculum, could be taught through the arts. I mentioned Sir Alec Clegg from Yorkshire. He visited this school and he talked about it as an epiphany. It formed the kind of baseline, convincing him about what really mattered in education. And he recruited the head teacher, Arthur Stone, and took him to Yorkshire, and he became an advisor for art and movement education. It's a really wonderful story. So that is an example. But of course, we haven't mentioned the backlash, the reaction to all this progressive adventure. That's another story.
Okay, thank you. I have a last question to the three of you before I open to the public. Maybe a very vague question. But Kathy, you said in the beginning that democracy is something that has to be worked on. And you were speaking about learning to live together. And yesterday in our workshop, Democratization of Knowledge, we heard that democracy also has to be learned. How can we learn democracy?
How many days do we have? Well, I think, so yesterday we were talking about the fact that sometimes we assume, so I was talking particularly about participation, which is a crucial element of democracy, right? Which for some reason has not been discussed very well, I think. We talk about democracy as a very sort of abstract concept, but participation is crucial. If there's no participation, there's no democracy. So I think when I said that participation has to be learned is that sometimes we assume, and this is the case, it was a very important aspect of the what was tried in the city of Porto Alegre. You open spaces for participation, and all of a sudden you have people who were never invited to participate, never thought that they had anything to say or to collaborate. They never even thought of themselves as worthy of participating in these very poor communities. And you have this, yesterday we were talking about in our workshop about this moment of panic where everybody looks at each other and say, what should we do now? And the thing is, participation and democracy is a learning process. We have to learn how to do that. I was talking yesterday about a sort of a grammar of participation that has to be invented, and it cannot be universal in that sense, because it is very related to context, to how are the relationships there, and we have to face issues of power when we talk about participation, because we have to understand who has the voice to talk in this particular space. And so that's what I meant by learning. There's a process of learning how to do that, how to negotiate, how to live together, so in the case of Porto Alegre, what I say, it's very interesting, because what had to happen in order for real participation to happen is that not only communities had to learn, and that's the position that we are put, right? The state and then the school system knows what to teach to the communities. There had to be a sort of a reverse process of learning. So the state and the state people who were embody the state in those particular moments had to learn how to interact with those particulars. So the state had to be taught how democracy is done, and that is not a simple thing to do. But I think in that particular context, history matters. By doing that, by practicing that, by doing that constantly and learning through the obstacles, that's how democracy is built. There's no other way.
Thank you. And Håkan, would you see a potential of learning democracy in urban pedagogy if you think of appropriating the space, appropriating the city, like learning the right to the city, or like becoming a citizenship, or like understanding the citizenship by urban pedagogy? Hopefully you can.
Yeah, it's difficult to be very, very precise. I will just, what I've been thinking about now when you ask questions and when I hear Louise' answers and Kathy's answers, is partly that I think that something that we have in common in our research, and also the practical experiences that Louise has from the Porto Alegre school, is that democracy is a learning process. Yes. That sort of tends to reoccur in our research and our opinions, and that is something that we have sort of identified. But then, in the contemporary world, that learning process is not always embraced. I mean, that is because you are positioning yourself or the society in an unstable situation. So democracy is something that is something that could always sort of tip over into something else that is less desirable, I would say, in an educational perspective or a societal perspective. But that is how society functions. So I guess in a realistic but still positive situation, there will always be some kind of dynamic conflict between education and power.
Thank you. Would you like to say something, Kathy, to that question?
I'm looking forward to the questions from the audience.
Okay.
But I would say what's in my mind at the moment are those people who are passionate about democratic schools. There are things called democratic schools out there, and they are interesting. But again, I would be careful with the label. Once you've got a label there, you know, democratic school, it's democratic. Democratic education, you must be doing something, you know, in the curriculum. Citizenship education. Remember what Alec Clegg said, the things that are most valuable are the things that are difficult to measure. So I would go with him with that. And there's plenty of examples of what we might call democratic practice in schooling, which is not labelled democratic school. And those, Kerry Facer talks about the seeds for the future school being in the present, and those are the seeds I'm interested in growing. And growth was a word that was used in the post-war period. So I would say, rather than ideal or democratic schools, growing schools, each generation being given the responsibility to grow a school, a community, if we are to have schools at all.